Hello, it's Brad Laurie or BlockchainBrad, and today we're talking about all things Parity Technology. Now, if you don't know what that is or what it stands for, that's simply because this team has been building for some time and in stealth mode for much of it. And today we have Joe Petrowski here to explain everything that they are doing and exactly what Parity Tech stands for. Joe, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brad.
You're welcome, mate. Now, as I said before, you have been busy and you are the research analyst at Parity Technology. And inside that, there's a lot more to explore and unpack, especially when it comes to blockchain, when it comes to innovation, when it comes to leading platforms, when it comes to Web3, and even some of the substrate we're going to be talking about connected to some of those key platforms. But before we do, I just want to touch on Parity Technology as a term with you, Joe. What essentially, comes to mind when you hear that phrase, Parity Technology?
Yeah, I would say what comes to mind is infrastructure. We develop infrastructure for Decentralized Web. And I guess like the other word that would come to mind would be generalization. So we try to really take these components and generalize them, make them as abstract as possible so that you can compose them and extend them into like more advanced logic. So like we started out back in 2015, coming out of Ethereum and like working on an Ethereum client. And then we built some more clients like for Bitcoin and Zcash. And when we started working on Polkadot, we really kind of realized like, hey, we're doing the same thing over and over again for different blockchains. This should really be like generalized and abstracted. And so that's what really started to focus on Substrate and being able to build this composable logic where you could build any kind of blockchain, or I should even really say like state machine. It doesn't really have to be a blockchain, using this framework and then be able to connect these. So when we have generalization, we can also make specialization. So we can have lots of different specialized state machines that can all communicate with each other and hopefully build something that's more advanced by composing these individual bits.
Right, and just to jump in, you raised a really good point about the state machine, almost going to one deeper level than the blockchain itself. And another point you made that was interesting also is being that infrastructural sort of technological team, in that your focus has been looking at what's working in the past since 2015, you mentioned, but progressing towards more of our core and central approach when it comes to, again, driving technology, engines that fire up the potential of blockchain. So do you want to just touch on that a little bit more, because you do know a lot about those technologies, Joe, in terms of state machine? How important is it to have developed from that initial ethos of supporting things like Ethereum, Bitcoin, and Zcash and beyond, and then really hone in on the past to build the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny that we call 2015 the past here in blockchain, because in most other industries that would just still be kind of like the present. So we're moving very fast. But yeah, I mean, a blockchain is like a type of state machine, right? It's like a special case of a state machine. And so,
well, let's talk about this in the sense of, obviously, state machine is the driver for not just Polkadot, for example. We know that Ethereum is also doing some amazing work. But what's exciting is, again, the way in which this is mapped out. So let's take it one step further with regard to the infrastructure that does exist in context of Parity. We see the likes of Web3 referenced quite a lot. And then we, as you mentioned before, Polkadot is a core development as well, and a very integral component of the technology that's moving forward. And then Parity sits in there as well. So do you want to just try and help us interconnect the three, understand the fundamental starting points in terms of team, in terms of technologies, in terms of, I guess, essentially how Parity really came to fruition?
yeah, so I mean, Parity kind of like came into being first before Web3 Foundation, before Polkadot was even thought of, just focused on the Ethereum work. And then when we came up with the idea for Polkadot, that's where we really started to like go more in this direction. And Web3 Foundation, they're more focused on like the research and advocacy for Polkadot. So how are we going to design this thing? Their job is really to like push the development of the Polkadot network. Parity is kind of like the primary team implementing Polkadot, but there's actually a lot of other teams. So like Web3 Foundation interacts with a lot of different groups. So like there's Soramitsu that's building a client in C++, and some other teams building clients in like Go, JavaScript. And so You know, Parity is kind of like the leading implementers, building our implementation in Rust, but Parity is more focused on like the actual engineering and like how do we actually create this thing and like turn it from an idea into something that's real. And so we do like a lot of the core protocol development, but also like the tooling to actually interact with these protocols because they're quite low level. And I think like that's just something else that we've seen over the last couple of years is like in an Ethereum client, you just kind of get like the full suite where you're talking to the protocol over like some server and it gives you like human readable responses, right? And like that wouldn't be normal in another protocol. Like if you were to talk to like TCP, you wouldn't be getting like human readable web pages, right? You'd be getting just like the string of bytes. And so then we have these like other protocols of like, well, how do we actually deal with these? And so that's like a direction we've gone in a lot with like Substrate and Polkadot is like just having like more abstract encodings, which requires extra like middleware between the actual protocol and the end user. So, you know, Web3 Foundation is really focused more on like building the community around Polkadot and researching what the protocol should be. But Parity is like really implementing that protocol and also building the tools so that people can interact with the protocol.
I see. So, you know, if we use some analogies, we've got Web3, the university, the theory that underpins it. And then we have the work that you guys are doing at Parity, which is really the pragmatic approach to making sure that the infrastructure is there. And that is reflected also in a lot of the slogans, a lot of the statements that are made about Parity in literature. One of them is a core blockchain infrastructure company. So I wanted to touch on this as well, because clearly it's a company, as stated, but also very much, you know, trying to drive forward applications, drive forward use. So do you want to touch on that in the time that you've been there? What can you say with regard to that evidence that there is that momentum, there is that pragmatism, there is that direction forward of actually building in the truest sense?
Yeah, I mean, like when I started like Substrate, the code base was still like very young. It was pre-version 1.0 and we're coming up on version 2.0. When it comes to like users and adoption, I mean, we're like in a funny place where, you know, Polkadot and Substrate are really like infrastructure for infrastructure. So we kind of intentionally don't focus on like certain uses or verticals because we want this to be as abstract as possible. We want it to be like for any vertical. So like if you compare it to like say AWS or something, they didn't decide like, well, we're going to go after the healthcare market, right? They were just like, we're going to make like generalized computing services for anybody who needs it. And so that's really what we're looking to. We want generalized blockchain infrastructure, whether you want to build your own blockchain with Substrate or connect to a larger network of other blockchains with Polkadot. Like,
it makes sense. So in that context, is it fair to say you're like the equivalent of the DeFi AWS in that, and we're going to touch on some comparisons or contrasts, you know, as we move on in this interview with other platforms that are also pursuing the same agenda and also other software.
I wouldn't even say DeFi.
Right, well, let's talk about that. Why not? Because DeFi, as you know, is thrown around very loosely right through the community. So I'd love to know your take on just reconceptualizing AWS, how you see it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think DeFi is like one particular vertical of blockchain, and there's a lot more out there in the world to decentralize than just finance. And it's like one of the disappointing things about DeFi to me is that we're just seeing like the recreation of a lot of centralized finance primitives. Like this industry kind of came out of the ethos that there was like there were problems like these instruments were actually like causing fragility in the system and that they were central points of the failure, not just the institutions behind them, but like the instruments themselves were fragile. And to just see those recreated on a blockchain, that doesn't necessarily heal the fact that like some of these instruments were actually toxic in the first place. Just because you put them on a different platform doesn't make them better. And some of these might be necessary to create other things, but I think like I wouldn't confuse just like putting something on a blockchain with actually like it may be decentralized, but that doesn't mean that it's like in the direction of like something that's better or more egalitarian.
I think you raised some very strong and very controversial points, and many of them I agree with, to be honest, because sometimes there is the slogan of DeFi simply to sell a token as well in you know the context of popular narratives. So, you know, to recap and, you know, deepen the discussion on this point, what you're saying is that we do see the influx of DeFi spread around throughout the crypto sphere. But more importantly, the agenda should be that underpinning infrastructure, that technology that drives forward true and empirically proven decentralization with purpose. So that's why I want to dig deeper into this. And what I also like hearing from you is that there is obviously that spectrum, not only of verticals, but also of the potential of technology to integrate with enterprise. So I would imagine there's not an aversion to enterprise into reformulated approaches or reconceptualized approaches to how mainstream do engage in contemporary technologies that are forward for change, are forward for a different direction. Now, that may not be instantly decentralized. It may be a progression towards that. But is it fair in saying that that's where Parity is focused, is actually providing the tooling, the software, that being a company that's trying to drive forward innovation, but in a pragmatic way, so that the process is seamless, but also it's focused and in some respects conservative as you move forward?
Yeah, I think that's maybe a better answer than what I had given you before.
No, mate, I don't think so. But let's talk about the team as well, because that's quite impressive to, again, not to inject any FOMO into this conversation. That's not my intention. But with 60 devs, with engineering seriously at the core of the skill sets here, 15 countries involved with that number of people, you have one of the founders, that's Gavin Wood, and then you have I apologize if I pronounce this wrong, but Judith Steiner as well as the CEO. You have some serious players in your team. Do you want to just comment on them, considering this team's growing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that number is probably even out of date on the 64. I mean, it's probably up more like around 80 or 90 developers now. We've really grown a lot over the last, say 6 months or so. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty intense team. I think everybody who comes into the team as a new joiner kind of feels like, oh, I really know my stuff. And then they get here in the first month and it's like, oh, wow, I have a lot to learn. And I know I went through that maybe more for 6 months than 1 month. But yeah, it's, we have a really talented team. And then of course, the founding suite with Gav and Yuta, incredibly talented and very far ahead of the industry and really leading with the development of Ethereum and now Polkadot. So it's a really exciting team to be a part of.
Absolutely. I really want to dig deep in that last comment you made. So we see the likes of Ethereum doing some interesting things right now. It certainly has a very powerful network effect right now, even in its current proof of work state, which is quite incredible, really, considering when you understand what the technology of proof of work does in comparison to something like Polkadot. And you mentioned also composability is a key part of it. Enterprise potential is also very much something that's going to be arguably a key component of the future in terms of adoption. But when it comes, to that team, there's references to the first iterations of Ethereum. And that's why I think it's important people understand, perhaps it's not a case of competition, but it's a case of, bettering technology, advancing on the past, trying to iterate. What are your thoughts on that? And do you want to reference a bit also with regard to Gavin, because he was the CTO of Ethereum?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the design of Polkadot is motivated by what happened, the design of Ethereum, and I guess how we would like to improve that. And so I know we kind of in our pre-chat decided not to go too deep down governance, but that was one of the things we kind of realized, hey, the process of actually upgrading Ethereum is really tedious and difficult, and so and it's also very centralized, right? Who makes the decisions, who enacts them, and these could be very different groups. It could be one group of people might make a decision, but you're kind of relying on miners to actually implement this decision. And then you're maybe relying on some other group, you could say exchanges or
a pool,
CoinMarketCap or whatever, to decide which, if there is a fork, which one they're going to call Ethereum versus some fork.
Right.
And so you've kind of you're missing this consensus on well, how do we make a change? How do we enact it? Which fork do we call it what? And it's not actually up to the stakeholders in the network. It's up to these groups who have have this insider power, whether that's through their organization or because like they happen to be like one of the founding members or like one of the developers. And those people might not be like the most qualified or like the
Well,
best.
they're certainly not
people
technologists
to
in
make
that context.
right.
Often the motivations are more fiscal or they're more financial, as you'd appreciate. And so that's where, you know, the imperative, arguably, certainly in Gavin's case, has been to iterate beyond proof of work. So let's dig a little bit deeper than we initially planned. Let's do that. Let's talk about governance in the context also of why it matters that Polkadot did iterate, especially given that they were in stealth mode for some time building this out, to make sure, arguably, that they were prepared for what's coming. And I really do mean that with the discussion we're going to have about the substrate and all of the startups that are now looking towards Polkadot.
Yeah, well, I mean, the key thing here is that in the governance of Polkadot, the actual like decision making is on chain, and so it's up to the stakeholders in the network to come to some decision about what to do. And that could be like changing a parameter, it could be like calling some function, it could be like upgrading the chain itself. And then like the really critical step is that the enactment happens autonomously. So you don't have to rely on validators or some other group to actually like upgrade software and make the choice. You don't have to rely on like some other third party listing service of like what they're going to call Polkadot. The actual upgrade is forkless, so it's like impossible to have a fork due to this upgrade, and so it actually carries out the decision of the stakeholders, and it puts that in a transparent way on chain. And I just like say like Polkadot's proof of stake, not proof of authority. So we launched in a proof of authority mode, but like we've transitioned to proof of stake. Yeah, so like we could go into the launch process a little bit, but that's going a little bit off topic.
Right. Well, I'm glad you clarified that. My apologies. I mean, my assumption was that POA was a key part of this. So the proof of stake, though, that's interesting you say that, because we see the narrative, the common thread of Ethereum now pushing for the same POS model. Now, in that context, what are some of those key distinctions, differentiators, once Ethereum does reach the POS? Clearly, you know, the fact that it's all completely on chain, that's something of a boon. But also in the context of decentralization, what I'm hearing from you is this is public, permissionless, and decentralized by design with the POS version of Polkadot.
Yeah, well, it's important not to conflate like the consensus algorithm with the upgradability. So, okay. You know, like you could still do this type of upgradability even with proof of work. So proof of stake is just kind of like how you select who your validators are. And the algorithms like that go on top of proof of stake to determine finality, they can happen in a deterministic way. It gives you like different guarantees about like what the canonical chain is. But the actual driver in like the governance thing and like being able to enact on chain is really like where the logic is hosted. So this is where Polkadot gets like quite abstract, but like you know, Ethereum is expressed like it's in the client. And so if you want to upgrade it, you have to just upgrade the client with this new logic that follows these new rules. And that's kind of why it's called a hard fork. You need to get all these people to update their clients in order to do it. And that would be the case whether it's on proof of stake or proof of work. On Polkadot, the client and the actual like runtime, like the rules of Polkadot, those are separate things. So the client hosts these rules, and those rules are all on chain, and we call it the runtime. And it's like this WebAssembly executable, and the client is just like a host environment to execute that. And so what we can do is when we actually like make an upgrade that would be a hard fork on another network, we're actually just putting these new rules onto the chain, and without updating the client, it can just start executing these new rules. So it's just going to say, hey, at block, you know, 1 million, stop executing these rules and start executing these new rules. And nobody really has to update anything. And so I think that's like an important distinction, is that the way that Polkadot expresses logic and the way that it hosts its own logic is fundamentally different. It's an extra layer of abstraction from any other blockchain network.
I think that's beautifully said. And you've made it clear that there's less of a boardroom approach in the way that there's almost this automaticity built in, you know, through the upgrades that are just built into the code. And I think one of the things we will do in the future is really delve deep into more of the governance structure, but you have articulated some key differences. And for those who want to know more, I'll put some links in below as well with regard to some of the publications that Joe has written and others as well, because they really do go much deeper into the differences with regard to governance and really explain clearly why Polkadot is worthy of understanding their governance model. So let's pull it back a little bit though, out of the depths of governance for a moment. Let's discuss a little bit more about enterprise. Now, that's a buzzword just as much as DeFi in the context of potential, utilizing the best of DLT and blockchain. So what do you think is the vision, for example, with Polkadot, given that we are still now looking for the future proof of adoption and users in real tangible context that we can actually assess properly according to the idea of utility?
Yeah, I mean, so I should say, when it comes to enterprise, Substrate and Polkadot weren't designed specifically with enterprise in mind. It just so happens that a lot of the abstractions and generalizations that we've made are useful also to enterprises and not just to a startup or an independent builder. And so if you look at the current state of enterprise, it's either through smart contracts or some clone, a fork of Ethereum that's run as this custom thing. And that's not really flexible. It kind of gives you two options. One is just use this out of the box solution. Just run this Ethereum node and you can do these things on it, but you can't really do anything else. Or you can write some smart contracts, but you're still very limited in what you can do. But it is a very fast deployment. Or you can write your own enterprise blockchain from scratch, but that's obviously going to be a huge investment. It might take you 6 months or a year to write this, and then you might decide, well, hey, this actually doesn't work for me, and then you've wasted a year. And so what we've done with Substrate is just it takes that development time from a year down to say a couple months, and you can still build a custom solution, and it still gives you better primitives to interact with other parties and interact with your off-chain world. So a blockchain, it is a state machine, so it kind of considers its state as the sandbox thing.
Right.
And it doesn't really natively have a way to interact with the outside world. And startups might be pretty flexible to that, and where they can kind of throw out what they have, or maybe that it's just a startup that wants to do a blockchain, and so they've built their whole startup around this idea of putting this logic and storage in a blockchain. But enterprises they're enterprises for a reason. They've been around for a long time. They have a lot of processes and systems in place that they don't want to just throw out the window. And so more historical blockchains don't give you very good tools to interact with those systems. And that's something we've built into Substrate via something called Offchain Workers, which we could do a whole other episode on.
Yes, and we will. So, okay, so Offchain Workers, you have a whole suite of tooling, and we know the likes of ConsenSys, for example, they have their software tooling as well. But I want to jump in there just for a second. I hope that's okay. The reason is that you talked about enterprise in the context of the technology, and even Parity is involved in this process. But what's very interesting is that there are two parts that are really catering for different needs in the enterprise sector. So we have Polkadot, being that conservative, pristine, and clean chain that's emerging right now. And then we have the likes of Kusama that certainly is perhaps underestimated in what is actually planned to do, what even Gavin's really supporting as well in that sense with regard to enterprise potential, experimentation, and even beyond its conceptualization as a testnet. So do you want to just reference Kusama and also Polkadot in the context of enterprise as well? Because that really does help paint a more replete picture of what is possible as the whole group of people who are supporting this very robust network are all pushing for.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to enterprises specifically, Polkadot is much more up their alley than Kusama. But Kusama is really interesting because it started out as an unaudited release of Polkadot. So this was back in August of last year, so almost a year ago. And we hadn't really done any audits on our Polkadot code base. We just kind of put together this network and threw it out there. And it broke a couple times. We had to restart it twice and hard fork it one or two times.
Hence you started early.
Yeah. But we discovered a lot of a lot of bugs, a lot of especially like consensus issues, consensus and networking, memory leaks, stuff like this that you can really only discover by having a network out there with a couple hundred validators, and you might not discover like if you just do like a private test net with 10 validators or something.
Right.
And getting people to just like use the chain, try to attack it, throw stuff at it. We learned a lot by deploying Kusama, and it's kind of kept this image of like, like the unaudited, like bleeding edge type of thing. But the thing is, like we've been upgrading it as we've had our code audited, as we've released like the production launch of Polkadot. And so Kusama is now like very well audited. Like that code has been like.
Glad you said that. So can you just repeat that, because people don't quite get that. So go ahead and repeat it, because again, I really want to enforce this through this interview. Allow Kusama to get some of that attention that it really hasn't had.
Yeah. Yeah. So like when Kusama started, like there was no audits. Like we just kind of like threw out this code base. And like now it's very highly audited. I think like Polkadot has undergone like 7 or 8 audits before we launched. And so this code that's in Kusama has like actually been highly audited, but also of course tested in the wild, like in production, which kind of lets Kusama go to the next level, which is let other people use Kusama for the same reason that we used Kusama. So like you might deploy a parachain to Kusama before you deploy your parachain to Polkadot. So Polkadot would be like the very conservative, like
relay chain.
There's a higher barrier to entry to like deploy a parachain on Polkadot, and like that's for good reason, because Polkadot is conservative by nature and is going to just have like higher requirements. In order to be on it.
Joe,
and so,
that makes a lot of sense, because if we're talking about enterprise, often there's an assumption that that's major corporations, consortiums, etc. They are going to look directly. They're going to bypass and go straight to the relay chain to Polkadot. No question, I would imagine. But the reason I mentioned in this conversation now about Kusama is because even though we're referencing enterprise, perhaps in the context of that we say business, because I do think that small startups, small businesses, they may look actually towards Kusama for the reasons you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's like a bright future for Kusama as people start to deploy parachains and start using it, which should actually be very soon. Like hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll start to see some parachains on Kusama.
Yeah, and we're starting to see the emergence of more startups talking about the core value of Kusama in a different light as well. So when we talk about things like the Canary network and test nets for Polkadot, do you think that narrative will change for Kusama, in that it will stand alone as its own independent mainnet operational system and technology that once again leads into its own robust network?
Yeah, absolutely. And like it's been kind of tough to express what Kusama is, because it's fundamentally like a new thing, right? Like it's not a test net, but it's also not our like production Polkadot, like the goal that we're going for with Polkadot. And so it kind of sits in the middle, right? It's like a testing ground, but it's not a test net. And yeah, I think this idea of like we've been calling it like a canary net. It's tough to express, but I think it'll kind of just take shape. And
I think it already is starting to be honest. There's a lot of people starting to really notice it. And I'm looking forward to learning more about it, to be quite honest. And that's why I appreciate your input from Parity, because you do know a lot about all of these different technologies, including Kusama. Now, if we go back across for a moment to Polkadot, what I wanted to try and touch on just broadly is the relay chain as opposed to parachains in context of infrastructure, so that we can understand exactly what the two do and how they perhaps relate also to Kusama in this context, and also the substrate.
Yeah, so the relay chain is really like infrastructure for infrastructure, and that would be like the other parachains in the system. And so parachains are meant to hold domain-specific logic. So they're supposed to be specialized blockchains. So this might be like a smart contract parachain, or a stablecoin parachain, or like a governance parachain, or something like this. That's supposed to do like very specific things. And then these parachains can communicate with each other via the primitives that the relay chain allows. So it's a little bit complicated, but it's important to kind of make this distinction that like when you have chain like parachains that are communicating with each other, they're not really like communicating through the relay chain. What the relay chain does is it provides the context for these chains to send messages directly to each other. So if you were to make like a comparison to Ethereum, you have different smart contracts and they can like interoperate with each other within the EVM environment. And they can do so because they share this context of like, hey, we have like the same validation rules. If one of us gets attacked and like the state rolls back by like 3 blocks, the other one's going to also like roll back by 3 blocks. So we're never like in the situation where I interact with another smart contract and then that smart contract, or I get attacked and then like now my message doesn't exist, right? But it does to them because they never rolled back before that message arrived. And so that's what like the relay chain provides, is that context. But unlike Ethereum, it kind of like pulls them out, where like in Ethereum, you have to execute all of that logic in every block. In Polkadot, it lets us execute this logic separately, and then like the relay chain ties it together. So,
so just to jump in, so there's more efficiency built in to the model. Also, there's more autonomy, and it's almost like you remove that sort of analogy of the hub or the brain being, you know, the main chain in Ethereum's context, and then you have that same the requirement for a lot of data needs, you know, a lot of the duplication issue of they've all got to work in the same synchronized scenario. That doesn't have to happen with Polkadot, from what you say.
Yeah, it's really not like it's not like a hub in the sense that like things are going through it. It allows these parachains to send messages directly to each other, like parachain to parachain, without going through the relay chain. But because of the relay chain, they have some guarantees about those messages, about their provenance, about what created them, about, for the sender, how it's going to be interpreted, and knowing that like if I receive a message from another chain, I know that chain hasn't been reverted to a state where it hadn't sent that message, right?
Sure. So that's going to really enable a much more efficient system overall. If there's not that constant reliance on, again, that the main chain, as it's called in Ethereum. I think that's really important for us to better understand, because that surely is going to be just another reason why perhaps this will flourish, because that's a significant development technologically from the likes of Ethereum, for example.
Yeah, being able to like pull we're kind of looking at, you know, like scalability via specialization, right? So we kind of take like, you know, we specialize these different blockchains so that they can each do their own thing, and we let them communicate. And a lot of people would call just those two things on their own interoperability and scalability. But it's not really safe scalability because you have no guarantees about the security. And that's really where Polkadot comes in, is like we look at these 3 things together, not as like isolated components. So like if you think of interoperability as message passing, those messages are really only as valuable as the context that they're sent in. And so Polkadot is really providing like the security to enable the context to have meaningful message passing, which then enables scalability because it lets you specialize without having to be worried about without being worried about the security of the other chains that you're communicating with.
I see. Well, again, it lends back to that argument of being pragmatic. Without all of those things overlapping, intersecting, there's really no point to building out this whole holistic approach, because they all need to, you know, collaborate to do the job intent, and that is provide for, you know, real use cases in the end. So
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
I can just like interrupt you. Like this is where like some of the like enterprise stuff, this is where like enterprises and like startups can kind of just like come together in a sense, because as a specialized blockchain in the Polkadot network, you have a lot of control over your state transitions and like who authors them. So like you know, like a more like bleeding edge like startups chain or something might have like a proof of stake network where they let anybody like kind of like join as we call them collator, to produce blocks for this parachain and like submit them to the network. But Polkadot itself, like as the relay chain, only really cares that it's getting like 1 block from one of these parachains. It doesn't want to get spammed with like 50 blocks when it really only has room for 1 block, right? And so, but it's really up to the parachain to decide like, well, how do I decide who gets to submit these blocks? And so you could have like I said, like one of these bleeding edge kind of like more decentralized focused startup chains that wants to like use a proof of stake to make it completely permissionless and let anybody submit these blocks. But you could also have like an enterprise chain within the network where it's using like proof of authority, and it's decided like these are the nodes that have the right to author blocks and like submit them to Polkadot. And this actually like it breaks the enterprise thing out of the sandbox. So like so far we've only seen enterprises use like these kind of like, you know, very like private blockchains that don't have any interaction with the outside
or
world.
databases even.
Yeah, this kind of gives you like this blend where you can have like your private chain that decides like, well, who's the authority, who gets to finalize, who gets to authorize, sorry, not finalize, who gets to author blocks and propose them. But it also gives you this interface to the other like public chains so that you can still get the benefit of interacting with them.
Okay. I want to jump in there because that's exciting what you're saying. So essentially, if we look at that quadrant, once again, I've talked about this in the past, of the private and the public, the permissioned and the permissionless, you really, or all those at Parity have underpinned through the work you've done a means in which Polkadot can cater for all in that quadrant. So me, for example, if I have an enterprise endeavor that I want to pursue utilizing Polkadot, I have all those options built in. And that's what you're sort of saying when it comes to, okay, I can use a parachain, but I can do that with permissioning in mind, or I can do that with a permissionless structure. That's really, really quite exciting for the whole spectrum of potential in business context, I would imagine, and even beyond that, you know, for experimentation for young startups as well. Now, I was going to wait till later, but this is a perfect segue. We see the likes of Baseline, for example, trying to establish and assert itself as what they call the cookbook for trying to establish Ethereum as a mainnet middleware, trying to integrate more enterprise through their open source collaborative working group. Essentially, that's what it is. So you see they are also pushing more in that direction. Already we see Polkadot through these kinds of built-in infrastructural approaches doing so, and optionality built in from the start. So what are your thoughts on the likes of Ethereum, for example, moving in the direction? We know ConsenSys is backing this idea. We know that they're also pro-enterprise and pro-software and tooling. But again, you see you guys, and I can see that, you know, that you've been building this for some time. So you have the capacity right there. You have an established baseline, but you certainly can do everything that Baseline are now hoping to offer.
Yeah, well, like to be honest, I've heard of Baseline, but I'm not super familiar with their structure, like what they're trying to do. Like, can you just give me like more background?
Well, just essentially, it's a core team of people chaired by John, and I'll put some links in below or let you know further. But essentially, the objective there is to try and provide a working group to better enable and enfranchise enterprise integration into Ethereum. So there's a working group of people that's constantly growing, includes more enterprise agents as well, and includes more startups in that working endeavor. And it really does directly correlate with ConsenSys. They also fund it. Ethereum devs are also directly involved. So there is direct lines into this from Ethereum, but their agenda is to basically open it up so that a public permissionless system can enfranchise more enterprise on the Ethereum network. That's really the agenda. And they treat it as what they deem as a mainnet middleware approach. So that's the agenda. But again, it's just a working group. It's open source where anyone can take part as, again, that cookbook and open it for recipe writers, I suppose. So that's the idea. But when I look at you guys, I look at something a little different in that this has come from an organized team. This has come from technology builders sort of in stealth for some time. So when I hear you say, I, as an enterprise party, can actually choose already now, that's interesting to me because that's exactly what the Baseline are trying to enable through these new initiatives and startups and working groups, when your working group is really the team itself.
Yeah. I mean, of course, like I can't speak too much for them. But yeah, I mean, like we're really hoping, or I mean, we're not hoping, like we're actively building to create these tools to make it easy to integrate with substrate-based chains and eventually Polkadot. And yeah, I mean, we have a small team internally that's like working specifically on like enterprise integrations and like that kind of tooling and support that they need.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, like I hope we see like a lot of solutions out there.
Yeah, and it's good to see that it's been on the agenda for some time. It is part of that internal infrastructure, and especially knowing that you have a team that's assigned specifically for that role. Now, I wanted to touch on the substrate a little bit more because it's much more public now, actually. People can go to different links, go to different websites and look at the full scope of what's now starting to emerge as a very exciting starting point where we see, I'm not sure of the numbers and hopefully you can tell us, but there's several of them now emerging where people can go and look into these startups. Recently, I spoke with Acala, for example, and Laminar is just one of many. What are your thoughts on the quality of startups that are now starting to engage, be listed on the substrate, experiment with the technology, utilize the parachain?
Yeah, I mean, we've had like a really big like uptick in people using Substrate in the last, say, 6 months. But also like should really give like a shout out to the people who have been building on this for like over a year. And like Acala and Laminar kind of fall into that bucket where they've been like not just building on this, but like actually contributing back to the code base for well over a year. And that was like back in a time where it was kind of like changing, like breaking on a weekly basis, like breaking changes. And so it's come like a really long way. And I think like the strides that we've made and the maturity of Substrate and like just how powerful it is now just being reflected in the teams that are building on it. And yeah, I mean, like you mentioned some of them, and
Please
we have
mention more because I have a few that I wrote down that I'm out of sequence in my notes, but I'm thinking of some, for example, Plasm or Kilt, please, yeah, go on. I'd love to hear someone from you rather than me list these out. One of the ones that Centrifuge is another one. There's several that are really coming forth now. Many people are starting to talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, like you're kind of hitting like some of the big ones, and then like I mean, we have like OS Coin building. They're called Radical, building on Substrate. We have Moonbeam is actually like a really cool one. That's like an interesting like connection with Ethereum. So you could just take your Ethereum smart contract and deploy it directly on this Moonbeam chain without any kind of modification. So instead of like talking to an Ethereum client, you're actually talking with the Substrate client underneath. But you can just deploy like the same exact contract as is.
Yes, and I saw Gavin retweet them actually recently, so he seemed really excited as well. And again, as someone who's the founder of Web3, as someone who's leading out, the whole and the ambitious approach of Polkadot, it's something that people start to notice when they see Moonbeam introduced. Now we're seeing the likes of many others come forth as well. Are there any other startups that are really piquing your interest? Not just as a technologist, but just to really look into what their startup focus is or their vertical, for example.
Yeah, I'm on the spot here.
You are. To be continued. We'll put some notes in. We'll both have a look, and we'll put some notes in below of some others to look at in the future. Now, just a quick rundown for those who would like to look more into Parity. I don't want to discuss this in detail, but these are some of the, I guess, the claims made in terms of being cutting edge as a technological team. So you say you're cutting edge cryptographers, you have a cellular system, your peer-to-peer tech, decentralized consensus architecture we've talked about, on-chain governance we've talked a little bit about and hinted there. The proof of authority is referenced, and you've also mentioned proof of stake is value prop. And then one that's interesting, and that is privacy. Now, Ethereum's mentioned in this context as well, but I wanted to better understand how you do cater for privacy when it comes to enterprise needs, because they're not always going to want everything on chain.
Yeah, I mean, that's having something on chain versus off chain is really only part of like the privacy equation, if you will, picture. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to off chain stuff, like our off chain workers are probably like the most advanced in the decentralized, like say blockchain ecosystem, and like they actually allow for non-deterministic tasks like random number generation or like HTTP requests that you wouldn't really be able to do like on a normal blockchain. So this could interact with something that's completely external. When it comes to on-chain, it's definitely like going to be a focus moving forward. We don't have like a ton of like the zero knowledge proof stuff baked into Polkadot, but we do have teams like that are building on Polkadot or building on Substrate with this stuff in mind. I think like one of them, Zero Chain. I'll have to double check that if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
I hope I'm not wrong.
no, I totally respect
Sorry
that.
to the team if I'm wrong.
No, that's okay. And I think that's important that we see those experimentations. That's the whole premise, I suppose, of that relay chain to parachain approach, is that you don't control in any way the initiatives themselves or the endeavors. You simply provide that underlying technology for the possibility and for the verticals. So it's a fair point you make, and it's good that you don't know what everyone's building because it's just growing so rapidly. Now, with regard to funding and runway, I wanted to talk about that because when Ethereum did their ICO, they didn't necessarily raise a huge amount of capital. If you do some comparisons with other ICOs of the day, we know that the likes of up to $1 billion was raised, and that certainly wasn't the case with Ethereum. Now, one thing that does provide a lot of confidence for many people looking into Polkadot is their organized approach to, I guess, a long-term runway or a long runway, and also strong funding and capital. Can you just give us sort of some sort of assurance that that is the case, and that there is, a strong capital base that underlies and underpins the technology itself?
Yeah, I can't say much more detail than that. There is a strong capital base that underlies it, at least for like the company side of it. I can talk a little bit about like the sustainability of Polkadot itself, because like, of course, we don't just want to rely on, say, getting like more funding coming in. So like, one of the things that we've put into Polkadot is this concept of a treasury that can actually like accumulate funds, and the chain, like these funds belong to the chain, and it's up to governance to distribute them. And so these come out of like the inflation or like block reward, if you will. It's really like an error reward, but I think that's going into like the details of proof of stake and consensus and everything. So we'll just consider it a block reward for now. But like, what do you actually do with those rewards? And like, some of them have to go to validators, but also like not as much have to go to validators as on a proof of work network, because you're not relying on that for keeping them honest, if you will. And so a portion of that goes into this thing that we have a treasury, that's actually on chain, and the decision making is on chain. So Polkadot, through its governance, can decide like how to apply these funds. And I think like that's really innovative in like having like a self-sustaining, like a self-funded chain, and it allows new things to come into being that didn't exist before. So like, we have this idea of like a person or a company like owning things, but we don't have a concept of like a blockchain owning things, right? And so we have like a treasury that's on chain, that's managed by the stakeholders of the blockchain. And like, since we have an interoperable network, and we're going to have bridges to say like Bitcoin or Ethereum, the governance of Polkadot could actually decide to like deploy some of these funds from the treasury to like take a stake in another network, like Ethereum or something.
And
like,
do you foresee that kind of thing, given that you mentioned it now?
I mean, like, that's kind of what Acala is doing, right? Like with their decentralized sovereign wealth fund. And like, you talked to them the other day, and like using the interoperability of Polkadot and like their own like parachain treasury, they can actually like acquire stake in other networks. And so like,
and knowing they are doing it would imply that the technology is there even from the original source of the technology itself, which is Polkadot.
Yeah, but like, like they is a little bit of like a slippery pronoun here, because I'm not talking about the Acala team or like the company or foundation or anything. I'm talking about like the Acala chain itself, like actually taking ownership or like having stake in another network. And that's like a new thing that didn't exist before.
Okay, so just to be clear, they, as in Acala, are able to do that precisely because of the technology that has been created through Parity and through Polkadot.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, that's an innovation in itself, right there. The fact that there can be this crossover, and interest in other platforms, that surely also suggests more of this notion of competition and collaboration as opposed to competition.
Yeah, I mean, like that, and that just goes back into like, I guess, like the scalability of the industry as a whole. Like, I think a lot of people, well, I don't want to generalize, but like there is this kind of like fundamental assumption that there's going to be a lot of blockchains in the world. There's not just going to be like one blockchain to rule them all, if you will. And blockchains, like, fundamentally, they rely on like their value for their security. And so value is by definition a limited resource. And so when we just start to have like independent blockchains that are secured by their own value independently, you're just going to be spreading thin. And this tends to follow like a power law distribution, like most things do naturally. And so it leaves like 95% of chains very vulnerable to attack from like a larger chain that could easily acquire a controlling stake in its validation. And so by pulling all of these chains together, it does allow a collaborative environment because their value actually like adds, it adds to the security of everybody, not just, it's not in competition with other chains. It's not trying to stay valuable so that it can resist attack from somebody else.
Right.
It's just adding security of the entire system.
And Joe, in doing that successfully, that's where it sets these layer ones apart from those that aren't successful and don't manage to create, I guess, a very holistic sort of technology that can coordinate all of the parachains successfully and attract users and attract developers and attract teams. You've done all of that as part of the Parity team. Now, this is a great segue into the question of consensus with regard to Joe Lubin, his work there, his association with the original Ethereum team, and also Gavin being the founder of Web3, being absolute core component, if not the most important person when it comes to building out Parity, when it comes to building out Polkadot, and even beyond that. You know, the brainchild, perhaps, you know, of many aspects, even of the original iterations of Ethereum. So my question more is about the agenda for Joe, the consensus team. You can't really suppose too much there, I'm sure, but you certainly are aware, I imagine, of the connection initially between Joe and Gavin, and now clearly they're going after different layer one technologies. They're building out different things. Joe's not the technologist, Gavin is. So what are your thoughts on the way in which the market share has moved towards consensus? The network effects have moved towards Ethereum when we see the likes of Parity, Gavin, Polkadot really starting to come up now.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I think there's like a few things I could say about this. I mean, first of all, like, I wasn't around back in those days. I was busy riding my bike. And so like, I don't know like a lot of that stuff, right? Like I wasn't there. And I don't want to speak for them. I mean, Ethereum was just like before Polkadot, like on a time scale, right? Like it was several years before Polkadot. I would question the network effects and how large they are.
Do you mean right now for Polkadot?
For Ethereum.
Okay.
Just for like the blockchain industry in general and like what we consider to be like, I think a lot of people have already declared like, well, this is like the biggest, so therefore it's the winner. And I really take issue with that because the whole industry is very small. And so, I mean, I think we can kind of like compare that with like if you look at like some of the like failures and what they've done to the industry versus like a more mature industry. So like, I mean, we look at like hacks and stuff that's like, you know, over $100 million is considered like massive, like a huge hit to the ecosystem. And it is like, I don't want to pretend that it's not like a lot of money. It is, but also like, I mean, like my first job out of university was in aerospace. And like, when we talk about like a mission failure, we're talking about a satellite that's like $5 or $10 billion. And then of course there's like repercussions from these kind of failures. But the industry like keeps going and it keeps evolving, right? And it's hard to imagine like a $5 billion failure in DeFi right now, right?
And that's because, you know, it's still so new. But Joe, we're also talking about experimentations right from the outset for both of these. And we haven't really seen a lot of empirical evidence of significant uptake beyond the scope of the crypto sphere. So, and that's kind of what you're alluding to. But my question more so is about, from this point forth, which do you think is really going to showcase some of those, that imperative of seeing that adoption be real, seeing the real world inclusion of businesses interacting beyond speculation, obviously, that we see that's rife in crypto, in a scenario where there is that true and proven evidence of the utility token being used, for example, that often, you know, fires the value of these startups. You know, that's the core engine itself. Right now, as you've alluding to, we see a lot of planning, a lot of hopes and dreams also built in to a lot of the DeFi movement, for example, Ethereum. But what's under the hood really, and what about the future?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like where I was going with that is like this whole industry is still very small, and if we're going to be successful, we can't just say like, well, we've captured like this percent of Ethereum developers or something, or like Ethereum developers constitute X percent of all blockchain developers or something. Um, it's really just like looking at such a small piece of the picture, and if this industry is going to be successful in like actually achieving its goals of decentralizing global power systems, not just financial systems, but just like centralized power in general. We're going to need like 10x or 100x or 1000x more developers than we have now. And so I don't look at any established group and take it for granted that that is like the network effect, because I think if we're successful, like we have to bring in a lot more people that aren't involved now, and then it becomes, well, which network do they go to?
Well, much respect to you,
have to
Joe. You know, much respect to you, because you could easily become a maximalist just like so many others. And even in your role, you're making the point that you're not. And I'm certainly not either. And I can understand why you're not, because again, it's the technology that needs to speak. It needs to prove itself. Now, in that context, you know, in pre-chats I've had, and the public would know if they've watched the interviews, I'm very much a proponent of real world technology, and Energy Web is one that I have supported for that exact reason. Now, they are also have been driven, or they've been very interested in the Polkadot network, interested in the technology there for good reason, obviously, given that there's so much potential for enterprises to essentially capitalize on established technology. Looking at the depth of infrastructure that's already there, many enterprises don't want to start from scratch, and they won't either. They don't have the skill sets. So I'm referencing this only as an example for real evidence of enterprise today. There's not many right now that are looking at or utilizing the Polkadot network in some way, or a parachain today in this time as we speak now, that are already moving that direction. So Energy Web, in my opinion, is one, and that's just my opinion. What are your thoughts on this today in terms of that empirical proof of moving just beyond the tinkering into something where it moves beyond into real validators, into real companies, into real global networks that are now engaging with the ecosystem?
I mean, well, we've already seen kind of like real companies engaging with, I mean, like Kusama is now at, I think, 400 validators, and a lot of those do come from like companies who have built like staking and validation or mining companies around blockchain. And I think that's kind of like the first wave is, right, you have to have like this infrastructure of reliable service providers who can actually run this in a fault tolerant, reliable way. And then like the technology has to be built on top of that. And
that's interesting you mentioned Kusama, because if they're the validators and they're legitimate, as you explained, but aren't they still within the crypto space? Or are they actually coming from the more mainstream sector? Because that's where I'm interested in as well, is are you getting some of the inclusion, the security creators as such with the validation? Are they coming from also sources outside of the crypto sphere? Because when we start to see more of that, that's when it gets really interesting.
Right. No, I mean, like most of the validators are, like specific to like the blockchain industry. Yeah, I'm trying to think of like our other, yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head.
That's okay. And you really shouldn't, because there aren't that many, to be honest, because we're still so early. But what's clear is with the examples we've talked about with Kusama and Energy Web, there's the possibility of looking into them to see how they are trying to create this. And certainly Kusama has already built that internally. With regard to transparency, I wanted to ask you about the GitHub. Many reports have come back about just how robust the repository is, one of the best out there, arguably. But in terms of access, given that you're a company, is this completely open source? What's the full rundown on the nature of your GitHub?
Yeah, I mean, like all of our protocol work and tooling is open source. So like our deployment tooling, Substrate, Polkadot, Polkadot.js, which is like one of the tools to like build wallets or front ends and like actually interface with Polkadot and Substrate. This is all open source. So yeah, they're all open public repos.
Well, as it should be. And do you want to comment on just how much has been done? Because there's repos and there's repos. There's submissions, and then there's a great deal of content from certain teams. Do you think you stand out compared to the majority?
Which majority of, like, you mean of other blockchain clients?
I do, yeah. Or even not just clients, but even just other startups, other platforms, or other parties using other platforms. Just more generally, when you do comparative analyses of different GitHub standards.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, so I wasn't really prepared.
That's okay.
I can maybe on the next one I can come with stats. But yeah, I mean, like, we have like a huge developer team, right? So like we're able to push a lot of changes, and I mean, I think Substrate and Polkadot together are over 1 million lines of code now.
But that's a lot. And, I did have a quick look at the GitHub, so I'll put a link below. It's really just to give people confidence that there's a lot of time being put into the code itself, and just building this out. It's not just fluff as some have been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Joe, one of the things I did is have a bit of a look at people you're interested in and startups you're interested in. So I looked at some of the people you follow and that kind of thing. So we talked about Gavin, he's one of them, but you also support, it seems, people like Andreas Antonopoulos, Eric Voorhees, Vitalik as well. I thought that was an interesting mix of people. So what do you look for when you look at the crypto space more generally, when it comes to quality? What does that mean for you in terms of people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess how did you get these followers?
Well, I just had a look at your Twitter. I just had a
Okay.
look at the kind of people that you seem to like.
Yeah, I'm quite limited in my my following there. Yeah, I mean, I would say I look for people who reason from first principles about like what we're trying to build, and yeah, don't get lost in like just some like adoption metric. And I would say, like, I don't agree with everything that everybody I follow says or anything, but I think like the people you mentioned are often reasoning from the first principles of like, what are we trying to design, and like, what does decentralization mean, and what are we trying to create? And I think, like, yeah, I mean, like, Eric is very focused on like finance and economics of it. That actually, like, I heard of Bitcoin like back in like 2011 or 12, because like Eric is a like friend of a friend, and I was like kind of in those circles like back in the day when I first heard of this. But yeah, I would say like those are like the primary things, is like who's reasoning from first principles about what we're designing. And I would say, just like, to turn this back towards like parity, and like I don't have insight into like other organizations, but what I think is really cool is like we see a lot of like blockchain like culture kind of talked about like, well, we want to create this like decentralized like utopia or something, but there's not really like any substance to it besides like PowerPoint slides and like nice talks. And then like you see this other end of like people who are really pushing for adoption at any cost, where like say, well, we got all these users, but it's really like, well, we just like kind of forked Ethereum and like started this private network, and now we're saying that like this company is using blockchain or something, but they haven't really like done like a massive step towards, they're not thinking from like the first principles of like, what is decentralization, what are we trying to actually create, who are we trying to empower.
That's a really good point. They didn't drive
like,
from the why. They perhaps weren't
like,
clear on their why.
yeah, I mean, like, just to like kind of finish this, like, what's really exciting about working at Parity and like on Polkadot is like, we do talk a lot about like the societal impact and like the philosophical drivers behind what we're building, but we actually create it. We don't just, we go from like, we actually take that like philosophy and we put it into code.
Yeah.
And you don't see a lot of people like actually bridge that gap.
You certainly don't. And that really does go back to the beginning of the conversation of Web3 across to Parity and then building into Polkadot. So you have the whole process. the full evidence there of how you approach this as a very significant team of many. Now, one of the other things I found interesting is that you also do your own podcast, and I want to give you a plug because it is high quality. The people you talk to, all the way from Gavin to others as well, known as the Relay Chain Podcast. Do you want to just comment on what you do there, why you also do that as part of your role?
Yeah. So we started this about a year ago. And I guess like why me? I was kind of interested in it, and like we had a few people try it out, and I don't think anybody else was that interested in it, and it just kind of like fell to me. I enjoyed like kind of like researching and like going in depth on what other people were doing, and like you get kind of lost in like, especially in a startup, like I don't want to like pin Parity, but like startups in general are very like heads down, and you're just trying to like build. And just like the effort of like doing the research and like going out to talk to somebody else. And I know like you're obviously like very prepared for this and have done your research. It takes a lot of time, and like, but it's also rewarding to like put that work in, to do like a good interview. And I don't know,
I really appreciate all your effort, to be honest, because not every party does that, not every team. And you have the skill sets right there, you have the knowledge base as well, and you are technological. So we really do appreciate that, Joe, for the time that you do spend. And it allows for people to have that free access to information. Because again, there are a lot of parties in crypto also forcing people to pay for that through private access. And so again, that's why I want people to know about what you do. You're literally in the team providing this information for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, we don't do any kind of like paid guests, or either like us paying them or them paying us. We don't do any of that. And I'd actually say like a lot of the episodes kind of take like different twists. It doesn't have like a super, like there are some podcasts that's like, I want to like explain how this technology works or something. And on Relay Chain, I've really done both, like talking about like how technology or concept works, but also like more like cultural or philosophical episodes that have been really fun. And so I just try to find, say, interesting people. And it's been like, it's kind of like a, it's almost like cheating, like getting to talk to people that like, if there's like really interesting people that you want to talk to, that it's kind of like an excuse, like, hey, I have a podcast.
I feel that same way. It's such a great way also to learn. I'm sure you appreciate that as well, just to have them there, and certainly even in this interview, having the chance to speak with you. So once again, I'll put links in below, because all the work you do there, Joe, really does matter. And because you put all those hours in, and as you know as well, it's not easy necessarily to elicit some of the key developments with the people you do talk to, but because you do, it does deserve that recognition. Now, just finally, we've touched on so much, but I wanted to just really allow people the chance to understand how they can engage more. How can they learn more? We know that your podcast is one, but what are other ways in which we can connect better with Parity, with Polkadot, with Web3, etc.?
Yeah, so if you just want to like learn, there's like the Polkadot wiki, like wiki.polkadot.network, and there's like all of our social media stuff. But I would definitely recommend like going into our public chats. So we have we use Riot, and like I can send you a link to put in the notes. But we have like a lot of public rooms, like Polkadot water cooler, Kusama water cooler, validator rooms, Substrate technical, where we help out people developing on Substrate. And I think like what's really cool is like these are public chats, and like Gav is actually really active in them, and all of our core developers are really active in them. So like you can go and like ask a question and you'll get an answer from Gav directly. Right?
Wow,
And
it doesn't get better than that. And I don't have some of those links, so I'll make sure through you, we'll put them below so that people can have access. Because one of the things we notice is that Telegram seems to be a common sort of thread for many of the startups building on Ethereum, but there seems to be a lot of focus on places like Discord and even Riot, as you mentioned, others, where there is new modes of communication and new platforms being used.
Yeah, I think there are some Telegram groups, but Riot is definitely our main focus and where you'll find most of our developers.
Right. Okay. Well, Joe, thank you so much for this interview. The focus was initially really just to provide an introduction into Parity. We've done a lot more than that, really. I think here we've touched on so much from Kusama all the way through to the fundamentals of the relay chain and Polkadot. We've looked and we've explored, I guess, what's evolving with the substrate. We've hinted on some of those startups. I did want to also mention some others I mentioned just out of respect. Just to reference, Plasm is another one if I didn't mention. There's also, I won't mention anymore, to be fair, because I don't want to single out any, but I do encourage people to go and look into more of what is out there. I'll put a link for the substrate so people can just sift through the information and perhaps look into them more. But Joe, thank you so much once again for providing really this introduction. Hopefully we can keep going, in time where we break pieces down into bite-sized chunks so that we can focus on key areas of development, key areas of focus, as Parity and as Polkadot continue to show that they are not going anywhere. In fact, they're doing the opposite. They're building and they're staying and they're claiming their position and their stake, with a pun intended, as they prove themselves via the blockchain and even beyond that.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and look forward to more of these.
No worries. Thanks for your time, Joe.